February 24th, 2022, Moscow, 6 a.m. Russian tanks crossed the Ukrainian border. By noon, the first wave of Western sanctions hits. Within 48 hours, the US, EU, and their allies unleash what Bloomberg called the most severe sanctions ever imposed on a major economy. Russia's currency collapses. The ruble crashes from 80 to the dollar all the way to 120. Almost 50% loss in 2 weeks. Russian stocks plummet. The Moscow exchange shuts down for a month. Half of Russia's foreign reserves, $300 billion, frozen overnight. Major Russian banks cut off from SWIFT, the global payment system. Apple, McDonald's, Visa, MasterCard, they all pull out. Economists predicted catastrophe. The International Monetary Fund forecast Russia's economy would shrink by 8.5%. The Russian currency would spiral into hyperinflation. The war would become financially impossible to sustain. Putin would be forced to withdraw or face economic collapse. Except that's not what happened. By April, just 2 months later, the ruble had fully recovered. By May, it was stronger than before the invasion. Russia's trade surplus hit record levels. Inflation stabilized. The economy contracted, yes, but only by 3%, not 8%. And the war? It's still going. 2 years later, fully funded. So what happened? How did Russia survive sanctions designed to cripple them? Look, Western policymakers are still scratching their heads. But the answer isn't magic. It's 3 very specific tricks. And if you understand these tricks, you understand why sanctions almost never work the way we want them to. Let me show you exactly how Russia pulled this off. Trick 1, the energy leverage. Here's the uncomfortable truth nobody wanted to admit. The sanctions had a massive hole. Natural gas. Europe needed Russian gas, desperately. Germany imported 55% of its gas from Russia. Italy, 40%. The Netherlands, 50%. You can't just replace that overnight. So the sanctions carved out an exception. Energy payments could continue. Russian gas and oil kept flowing, and European money kept flowing back. About $1 billion per day, every single day. While the ruble was supposedly collapsing, Russia was earning $30 billion per month from energy exports alone. But it gets better for Russia. You see, when the West froze Russian reserves and cut banks from SWIFT, oil and gas prices spiked. Fear of supply disruption sent Brent crude from $90 a barrel to $130. Natural gas prices in Europe tripled, so Russia was selling less volume, but at much higher prices. The math worked out beautifully for Moscow. Now, Europe thought they were being smart. They said, we'll keep buying Russian energy, but we'll phase it out over time. We'll find alternatives, LNG terminals, renewable energy, independence by 2025. Except building that infrastructure takes years. And in the meantime, Russia was making record profits. China and India noticed this too. They told Russia, look, if Europe doesn't want your oil, we'll take it, at a discount. Russia started selling oil to India at $70 a barrel instead of $100. India refined it, then sold it to Europe at market price. Same Russian oil, different route. Higher European prices. India profits, Russia profits. Only Europe loses. By mid-2022, China and India were buying more Russian oil than they ever had. China's imports from Russia hit record levels in May. India's imports increased tenfold. The sanctions were supposed to isolate Russia. Instead, they accelerated Russia's pivot to Asia. Trick 2, the capital controls. Now, this is where it gets technical, but stay with me because this is the genius part. When sanctions hit and the ruble crashed, Russians panicked. They tried to move money out of the country. Buy dollars, buy euros. Anything to protect their savings. This is called capital flight. And it's how currencies really collapse. When everyone's trying to sell, the currency goes to zero. But Russia's central bank moved fast. Within days, they implemented the strictest capital controls Russia had seen since the Soviet era. First, they banned Russian residents from buying foreign currency. You literally could not go to a bank and exchange rubles for dollars. The government said no. Second, they forced Russian companies to convert 80% of their foreign earnings into rubles. If you're Gazprom and you just sold gas to Europe for euros, you had to exchange 80% of those euros for rubles immediately. This created artificial demand for the ruble. Companies needed rubles to comply with the law, but nobody was selling rubles. So the exchange rate had to go up, supply and demand. Third, they raised interest rates to 20%. Think about that, 20%. If you had rubles in a Russian bank, you were earning 20% annual interest. That's an incredible incentive not to sell. Now here's what the Western sanctions theoretically should have done. They froze Russia's foreign reserves, which meant Russia couldn't use those reserves to buy rubles and defend the currency. That's the whole point. Force Russia to let the currency collapse. But the capital controls bypassed this entirely. Russia didn't need to use reserves to buy rubles because they forced companies to do it. The central bank essentially delegated currency defense to the private sector. By May 2022, The combination of capital controls and forced currency conversion had stabilized the ruble. It traded at 75 to the dollar, better than before the invasion. Sanctions were supposed to crash the currency. Instead, it got stronger. Now, there's a massive cost to this. Capital controls strangle the economy. Russian companies can't invest abroad. Russians can't protect their savings. Growth slows, but Russia made a choice. Short-term economic pain was acceptable if it meant the currency didn't collapse. Trick 3, the yuan pivot. Look, this is the one that should worry Washington the most. When Russia got cut off from dollars and euros, they didn't just sit there and suffer. They built an alternative financial system, with China's help. In September 2022, Gazprom announced they'd signed a deal with China. All future gas payments would be in yuan and rubles, not dollars. China's energy imports from Russia would bypass the dollar entirely. This was huge. China is the world's largest energy importer. If Russia-China energy trade happens in yuan, that's hundreds of billions of dollars per year in transactions that don't need dollars. It's a direct challenge to dollar dominance, but it's not just energy. Russia and China had been preparing for this since 2014, after the first round of sanctions over Crimea. They signed currency swap agreements. They connected their payment systems. China's CIPS, cross-border interbank payment system, became Russia's alternative to SWIFT. By 2023, the yuan became the most traded currency on the Moscow exchange. More than the dollar, more than the euro. Russian banks held $68.7 billion in yuan, more than they held in dollars. Russia essentially swapped dollar dependence for yuan dependence. Now, this creates new vulnerabilities for Russia. They're now dependent on Beijing's goodwill. If China decides to cut Russia off, Moscow has the same problem but with yuan instead of dollars. China controls the exchange rate. China controls access to yuan liquidity. Russia went from being pressured by the West to being dependent on the East. But here's why this matters for the global financial system. Russia proved it's possible to operate outside the dollar system. Not easily, not without costs, but it's possible. Other countries noticed. Saudi Arabia started accepting yuan for oil. Brazil and China signed currency swap deals. The BRICS countries accelerated plans for alternative payment systems. The sanctions on Russia didn't just fail to collapse Russia. They accelerated de-dollarization globally. So let's be clear about what actually happened. The sanctions hurt Russia. The economy contracted, living standards fell. Russia can't access Western technology. Airlines are struggling without parts. Car production dropped 95% because they can't import components. This isn't a success story for Russia, but it's also not the collapse that was predicted. Russia adapted. They found workarounds. And most importantly, they stayed financially viable enough to keep funding the war. You see, the problem with sanctions is they assume the target country has no options, that they need Western financial systems, that they need dollars, that they can't survive isolation. But Russia had 3 massive advantages: energy exports that Europe couldn't replace, a willingness to implement draconian capital controls, and a partnership with China that provided an alternative financial infrastructure. Western policymakers bet that economic pain would force political change, or that Russians would turn on Putin, that the oligarchs would demand an end to the war. It didn't happen, because the pain was distributed to ordinary Russians, not the people making decisions. The elite protected themselves. The central bank protected the currency, and China provided the escape route. Now, this doesn't mean sanctions are useless. They're degrading Russia's long-term economic capacity. The technology cutoffs will hurt. The brain drain will hurt. But in the short term, in the time frame that matters for stopping a war, the sanctions didn't work. And that's a huge problem for Western foreign policy. Because if sanctions don't work on Russia, who do they work on? If you made it this far, drop your feedback in the comments. And if you want to understand what's happening with the dollar globally, watch my video on BRICS, creating alternative payment systems. Because what Russia did is becoming a blueprint. Thanks for watching.